The diner was the kind of place that seemed to stand still in time. Small, with cracked leather booths and the lingering scent of coffee that seemed baked into the walls. The waitstaff knew most of the regulars by name, their voices a friendly hum as they moved between tables. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the simple place, and it was here that Eli Sanders sat, gazing quietly into his coffee. Eli was a tall man, though his years had stooped his back and added a slight tremor to his hands. His hair, once a deep black, was now gray and thin, framing a face etched with both age and wisdom. Today, he wore a brown corduroy jacket that was frayed around the edges but clean, a testament to his pride in himself. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he did speak, his voice carried the calm authority of someone who had lived through things others might only read about. It had been 2 weeks since his son, Marcus, had been sworn in as chief of police. A sense of pride filled Eli every time he thought about it, pride tempered by worry. He'd spent his own life battling the quiet, persistent forces of prejudice, and he knew firsthand how difficult it could be to earn respect as a black man. He had been among the first to fight for his country in Vietnam, seen things most could only imagine, and yet he knew that in many eyes, his skin still spoke louder than his deeds. And now, with Marcus in the most visible role a man could hold in this small town, Eli worried about what challenges lay ahead for his son. He glanced at the small clock above the diner counter. Marcus was late, though Eli didn't mind much. The boy was likely tied up with some work at the station. The position had already brought new responsibilities and demands that Marcus took seriously, as he always did. Marcus was a good man, fair, hardworking, and patient. Eli knew his son would make a real difference here. And perhaps, he thought, things were finally changing for the better. The bell above the door jingled, and Eli looked up, half expecting to see Marcus. Instead, he saw Sue, the diner's longtime waitress, who caught his eye and smiled. "Mr. Sanders," she greeted warmly as she walked over, her hands clasped around a coffee pot. "Can I top that off for you?" Eli returned her smile, nodding. "Much obliged, Sue." She poured more coffee into his cup, then rested her hand on his shoulder briefly. "Waiting on Marcus, aren't you?" "Always running a bit late," Eli said with a chuckle. "But that's the job, I suppose." Sue grinned. "He's a busy man now, your boy. The whole town's talking about how lucky we are to have him as chief." Eli's smile softened, his eyes distant with the quiet pride he held. "He's doing all right," he murmured. Sue patted his shoulder once more before returning to the counter. Eli took a sip of his coffee, savoring its warmth as he watched the door. He let his thoughts drift, traveling back to his own years in uniform. He remembered the long nights, the bitter cold, and the sounds of battle echoing through dense jungles. He remembered his comrades, many of whom hadn't made it back, and he remembered the feeling that sustained him, the sense of duty to a country that had given him so little, yet demanded so much. But then, he had met his wife, and the long, dark nights of war had seemed to fall away. He'd built a life for himself, worked his way through teaching high school history, and raised Marcus, who'd been his proudest achievement. No battlefield, no struggle, could compare to the pride he felt in that boy. Just as he was starting to lose himself in those thoughts, he noticed 2 men walking into the diner. They weren't familiar faces, not locals. Both were dressed in crisp police uniforms, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. They paused by the door, looking around the room as though they were searching for something, or someone. Eli's gaze returned to his coffee, assuming they were just passing through. But then, the 2 officers started walking directly toward him, their footsteps loud and deliberate on the linoleum floor. The bell above the door jingled again as the 2 officers entered. Eli didn't look up immediately, his mind still lingering on the thoughts of his son. He heard the scrape of chairs against the floor, the soft murmur of voices around the room, but it was their footsteps that caught his attention. The taller of the 2, Officer Ray Collins, moved with a purpose, his eyes scanning the room. Collins had a way of carrying himself that suggested both confidence and authority, a swagger that came with years of policing. His partner, Officer Joel Barnes, was younger, still fresh-faced, still learning the ropes. He stuck close to Collins, taking in everything with the wide-eyed curiosity of someone still trying to prove himself. Eli felt the weight of their gaze even before they reached him. Colin's eyes flicked over him briefly, then lingered, his expression narrowing slightly. The younger officer hesitated, looking around as if unsure about what they were doing, but Collins spoke before he could voice his uncertainty. They stopped at Eli's table, and without the slightest greeting, Collins leaned in, his tone sharp and demanding. "What are you doing here?" Collins asked, his eyes narrowing as though Eli had done something wrong just by sitting in the diner. His voice held no warmth, no politeness, just a coldness that made Eli's spine straighten. Eli, unfazed by the interruption, took another slow sip of his coffee. He had dealt with far worse in his life, much worse than the ill-mannered officers standing before him. After a moment, he looked up at Collins, his eyes steady. "I'm waiting for my son," Eli replied, his voice calm, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. Collins wasn't satisfied with that. He studied Eli's face, searching for something, anything that didn't fit. The man was old, dressed simply, but something about him didn't sit right with Collins. Maybe it was the way Eli carried himself, like he belonged in a place like this, one of the few black men in the mostly white diner. Or maybe it was the fact that he had the audacity to sit at a corner table without so much as flinching under the officer's glare. "Your son?" Collins repeated, smirking. "What? You think a little old man like you just walks into a diner like this and fits in with the big boys?" The younger officer, Barnes, chuckled softly at the remark, though his smile faded quickly when Collins shot him a warning look. But Eli didn't react to the taunt. He had heard worse. He had fought battles far tougher than this one, fought against enemies who never once questioned his right to be wherever he wanted to be. "I told you," Eli said, his voice unchanged. "I'm waiting for my son." Collins wasn't done. The dismissal in Eli's voice, the lack of fear or anxiety, irritated him. He took a step closer, his voice dropping lower, as though trying to provoke a reaction. "You're not from around here," Collins said, his tone implying a challenge. "I don't see too many of you folks in places like this. You sure you belong?" Eli's eyes met his without flinching. "I belong wherever I choose to be," he replied evenly, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of experience. Barnes, who had been looking between Collins and Eli with growing discomfort, finally spoke up. "Ray, maybe we should," but Collins cut him off with a sharp gesture, his attention fixed solely on Eli. "Let me see some ID," Collins demanded, his words clipped. Eli, who had been expecting this, slowly reached into his jacket pocket. His fingers brushed over the smooth surface of his veteran's ID, an object that had been with him for years, through decades of hardship, through the battlefields of Vietnam and the struggles of civilian life. It had been a symbol of his service, his sacrifice for the country that had never fully accepted him. He placed the card in Collins' outstretched hand, his gaze steady, waiting. Collins didn't look at it right away. He glanced at it briefly, then sneered, his lips curling in disdain as he handed it back with a flick of his wrist. "This is probably fake," he muttered dismissively, as if a piece of paper could suddenly erase everything Eli had done, everything he had endured. Eli's jaw tightened. He could feel the injustice of the moment, but he didn't let it break his composure. He had fought for this country. He had given up years of his life, seen things no man should see, and yet here he was, being treated like a criminal for simply existing. But Collins wasn't done. "That doesn't mean anything," Collins said, his eyes narrowing as he continued. "You're telling me you were in Vietnam? A man like you? People like you didn't get that kind of treatment. You were probably just washing dishes or doing manual labor back then." The words hit harder than Eli expected, not because they were new. He had heard them before, but because of the arrogance behind them. Collins didn't see him as a soldier, as a veteran who had served with pride. No, to him, Eli was just a stereotype. Barnes, standing uncomfortably beside his partner, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He couldn't meet Eli's gaze. His stomach churned with unease as Collins continued to humiliate the old man in front of the whole diner. He had grown up with a father who'd taught him about respect, about right and wrong, and this wasn't right. But Collins didn't care. He leaned in closer to Eli, towering over him, determined to break his spirit. "Maybe you should just leave, old man," Collins said, his voice cold and threatening. "We don't want trouble in here." The tension in the diner grew thick. The other patrons glanced nervously at one another, but no one spoke. No one moved. Eli's composure remained unchanged, but his patience was thinning. He had lived through worse than this, fought for a country that had never truly accepted him, only to come home and face prejudice on his own soil. This moment, this small injustice, was not the worst he had faced, but it was one more reminder of how far things still had to go. With a steady hand, Eli reached for his cane, the smooth wood of it feeling familiar in his grip. But before he could stand, Collins made his move. "Get up," Collins ordered sharply, pushing Eli's chair back with a force that caused it to crash to the ground. The clatter echoed through the room, and all eyes turned to the scene unfolding before them. Eli slowly stood, his movements deliberate, his face a mask of quiet defiance. But just as he was about to speak, Collins grabbed his wrist. "You're not going anywhere until we say so," he sneered. And that's when everything changed. The tension in the diner was palpable, and as Eli stood there, calm yet resolute, he could feel the room's gaze shift from indifference to concern. The crash of Eli's chair echoed through the diner, slicing through the low murmur of conversation like a blade. Every eye was on them now, some filled with curiosity, others with concern. The air grew thick, and an uncomfortable silence settled over the room, broken only by the sound of Collins' voice, sharp, harsh, laced with disdain. "Stand up straight," Collins barked as Eli rose slowly to his feet, his movements dignified but deliberate. Eli's face remained impassive, his hands relaxed by his sides, though there was an unmistakable flicker of anger beneath his calm exterior. Collins moved in close, looking Eli up and down with a sneer. "What's a man like you doing in a place like this anyway?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The crowd's eyes flicked between the two, their unease growing with each word. "I told you already," Eli said in a steady voice. "I'm waiting for my son." He held Collins' gaze, refusing to shrink or show fear, even as the officer loomed over him. But Collins wasn't satisfied. He was used to people backing down, used to seeing fear and submission in the eyes of those he confronted. But Eli's calm resistance seemed to needle him, chipping away at his confidence, fueling his anger. Collins let out a hollow chuckle, shaking his head. "You think just because you wear that old jacket and carry some worn-out ID that you're somebody special?" He glanced around the diner, a smirk tugging at his mouth. "People like you don't belong in places like this." Eli's jaw tightened, and he took a slow, deep breath. He knew that reacting would only give Collins the excuse he was looking for, the permission he seemed so eager to find. Years of quiet resistance had taught him the power of holding one's ground without losing one's dignity. He met Collins' gaze evenly, saying nothing, letting the silence speak for him. But Collins wasn't done. He wanted a reaction. He needed one. "You think you're a hero, don't you?" Collins said, his voice mocking. "Wearing that old veteran ID, like it actually means something." He reached forward, flicking the edge of Eli's jacket in contempt. "You were probably peeling potatoes or scrubbing floors during the war. Men like you weren't on the front lines." A muscle in Eli's jaw clenched, but he remained silent. He had heard these words before, from people who didn't understand, who couldn't understand, what it was like to serve in a place where survival was all that mattered, where color didn't make a difference when bullets were flying past your head. His service had been real. His sacrifice had been real. But to Collins, it was invisible, just like everything else Eli had fought for. "Maybe you should just leave," Collins suggested coldly, crossing his arms, "before we have to remove you ourselves." Eli's gaze didn't waver. "I have a right to be here," he replied quietly, "just like anyone else." The calm strength in his voice seemed to rile Collins even more. He stepped closer, invading Eli's space, as if daring him to push back. "Let's see what rights you have," Collins said, his tone low and threatening. He turned to Officer Barnes, who had been standing to the side, visibly uncomfortable. "Barnes," he called out, his voice sharp, "pat him down." Make sure he's not carrying anything suspicious. Barnes hesitated, glancing at Eli with a flicker of unease. The young officer had seen the looks from the other patrons, the subtle shake of heads, the tension that crackled in the air. But he also knew that refusing Collins' order would mean serious consequences for his own career. He swallowed hard, then took a tentative step forward. "Sir," Barnes said quietly, addressing Eli with a hint of respect, "I'm going to have to ask you to comply." His voice held a tremor of apology. Eli nodded, his eyes softening slightly as he looked at the young officer. He saw a bit of himself in Barnes, a young man trying to prove himself, caught in the currents of authority and expectation. Without a word, Eli raised his arms slightly, his expression calm, as if to say, "I've faced worse than this. I can face this too." Barnes approached slowly, his movements hesitant as he patted down Eli's jacket and trousers. He didn't find anything suspicious, of course, only the solid bulk of Eli's wallet, his keys, and a few folded papers. "Nothing here," Barnes muttered, stepping back and casting a cautious glance at Collins, hoping the answer would end the encounter. But Collins was relentless. He took a step closer to Eli, his eyes flashing with irritation. "That's because he's clever," Collins sneered. "Knows just how to hide it." As if to emphasize his words, Collins snatched up Eli's veteran's hat from the table. It was a simple, worn cap, a faded symbol of Eli's pride and service. Collins held it up with a look of disdain, his fingers brushing over the words printed on the front. "You think you deserve to wear this?" he asked, sneering. And without warning, he tossed it onto the floor, grinding it beneath his shoe with deliberate cruelty. The act was small, but the impact was sharp and immediate. The diner fell into a stunned silence as the patrons watched, a mixture of disbelief and outrage flashing in their eyes. No one spoke up. No one dared. For the first time, a flicker of anger crossed Eli's face. His gaze dropped to the hat, crushed beneath Collins' shoe. His hands clenched at his sides, and for a moment, he felt a surge of rage that he hadn't felt in years. Memories of hardship, of sacrifice, of everything he had endured to be where he was today came flooding back, all reduced to a twisted smirk and a careless gesture. But he kept his composure. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. He wouldn't let them see him break. "Now, old man," Collins said, leaning in close, his voice a low murmur meant only for Eli. "Are you going to walk out of here quietly, or are we going to have a real problem?" Eli straightened, his shoulders squaring as he looked Collins in the eye. "I'm not going anywhere," he replied softly. "I have every right to be here, and I'll stay until my son arrives." Collins' face twisted with fury, and before anyone could react, he grabbed Eli's wrist and twisted it sharply behind his back. A gasp escaped from the diners, a collective intake of breath as they watched the elderly man wince in pain. But still, Eli didn't cry out. "You think you're tough, huh?" Collins muttered, his grip tightening. "Think you're somebody special?" Barnes shifted uncomfortably, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. He couldn't shake the growing sense of wrongness, the feeling that this was more than just a routine encounter. "Ray," Barnes said softly, his voice wavering, "I think we should let him go. He's not causing any trouble." But Collins ignored him, his attention focused solely on Eli. "Oh, we'll let him go," he replied, a twisted smile playing on his lips, "just as soon as he learns his place." With one final, brutal twist, Collins forced Eli's arm higher, pushing him down toward the table. Eli clenched his teeth, refusing to cry out, his pride and resilience holding him steady even as the pain coursed through his body. He knew what this was. He had faced it before, in 100 different ways, in 1,000 different forms. It was the same cruelty, the same hatred, cloaked in a new uniform, a new face. And he knew that showing any sign of weakness would only feed it. But just as he was about to say something, anything, to break the silence, the bell above the diner door chimed. A figure stepped inside, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a sharp gaze and an air of authority that filled the room. The diner's occupants turned, a wave of recognition and respect rippling through the crowd as they realized who had entered. Eli's heart lifted slightly as he looked up, his eyes meeting the gaze of his son, Marcus, now chief of police, who stood frozen in the doorway, his face a mask of shock and fury. The air was electric as Marcus Sanders took in the scene before him. His eyes fell on his father, Eli, bent over with his arm twisted behind him, and on the two officers holding him down. A wave of fury flashed across Marcus's face, but he quickly stifled it, replacing it with a mask of steely composure. "Let him go," Marcus ordered, his voice clear and commanding. At the sound of his voice, Officer Joel Barnes flinched and immediately let go of Eli's arm, stepping back as though he had just woken up from a bad dream. But Lieutenant Ray Collins, still gripping Eli's wrist, turned and scoffed, barely registering Marcus' rank. To Collins, Marcus was just another figure in a uniform, one that wouldn't intimidate him. "Chief Sanders," Collins said with a smirk, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Didn't realize we'd have company today." He kept his grip on Eli, squeezing just a bit harder, as if to test how far he could push things. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. His gaze was icy, unwavering. "I said, let him go," he repeated, his voice cutting through the diner's tense silence. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in it was unmistakable. Slowly, with obvious reluctance, Collins released Eli's arm, letting the older man straighten with as much dignity as he could muster. Eli's face showed a flicker of pain, but his expression quickly softened when he looked at his son. Despite everything, there was a glint of pride in Eli's eyes. His son was here, standing up for him, not because he was family, but because it was right. Marcus stepped forward, placing himself between his father and the officers. The patrons of the diner watched the scene unfold with rapt attention, whispering amongst themselves, unsure of what would happen next. "Is there a problem here, Collins?" Marcus asked, his voice laced with barely contained anger. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're harassing a civilian without any cause." Collins crossed his arms, not bothering to hide his disdain. "A civilian who was loitering," he replied smugly, gesturing dismissively at Eli. "This guy comes in here, taking up a table and making everyone uncomfortable. We were simply making sure he wasn't causing trouble." Marcus's eyes flashed. "My father is a respected veteran and a resident of this town. He has every right to be here, just like anyone else." Collins's smirk faltered, but only slightly. "I didn't realize he was related to you," he said, a mocking lilt still evident in his tone. "Doesn't change the fact that he didn't belong here." Marcus took a deep breath, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "Do you understand what you're saying?" he asked quietly, his voice dangerously calm. "You're telling me that a man who fought for this country, who risked his life for his countrymen, regardless of their color or background, doesn't belong here?" Collins shifted, visibly uncomfortable, but he attempted to stand his ground. "With all due respect, sir, he wasn't exactly cooperating. People like him, they think they're above everyone else just because they did a tour or two." "People like him?" Marcus echoed, his tone turning cold. "People like my father, who served with honor, don't need your approval to sit in a diner and wait for their family. In fact, I'd say it's people like you who don't belong in this uniform if you think you can treat people this way." The diner fell silent, every word heavy in the air. Collins's smirk finally faded, replaced with a look of unease as he processed the gravity of what he had done. Eli watched his son in silence, a deep sense of pride swelling in his chest. He could see the strength in Marcus's stance, the justice in his voice, and it reminded him of the fire he himself once held. But more than anything, Eli was proud of the man his son had become, a man who would stand up for others, even when it wasn't easy. Collins shifted uncomfortably, the swagger he'd worn so confidently moments before now visibly shaken. His glance darted to the other patrons in the diner, many of whom were watching him with judgmental eyes. For the first time, he seemed to realize that he wasn't in control of the room anymore. "Look, Chief," Collins began, his voice softening, "we didn't know who he was. We didn't mean to disrespect anyone important." Marcus's face hardened. "Important? You think respect is something people have to earn based on who they are or who they know?" His voice was cold, biting. Every person deserves respect, Collins. Not because of who they're related to, not because of their rank, but because they're human. Officer Barnes looked at Marcus, his face pale and apologetic. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to go along with it. His voice was barely a whisper, his eyes downcast. Marcus turned his gaze to Barnes. Why did you go along with it, Officer Barnes? He asked, his tone softened but serious. Why did you think it was okay to treat my father, anyone, like this? Barnes shifted, looking at his shoes. I didn't want to, sir. I didn't think I had a choice. Everyone has a choice, Marcus replied quietly, even when it's hard, even when it could cost you something. Integrity is a choice. The young officer swallowed, nodding silently, his shame evident. Collins, however, wasn't so easily subdued. He straightened, the last remnants of his arrogance surfacing as he tried to regain his composure. Look, we made a mistake, all right? But you don't have to lecture me. I've been on the force longer than you have, Chief Sanders. Marcus's expression was one of controlled anger. And that should mean you know better, he replied icily. It should mean you know that the badge you wear doesn't make you better than anyone else. It means you have a responsibility to serve and protect every person in this town, not just the ones you think belong here. The patrons in the diner watched in silence, many of them nodding subtly, some murmuring their agreement. Collins glanced around, realizing that no one was on his side anymore. His bravado was crumbling, replaced with a growing sense of fear and shame. This isn't the first time I've heard complaints about you, Collins, Marcus continued, his tone uncompromising. But it will be the last. You'll report to my office first thing tomorrow. We're going to have a serious conversation about your conduct. Collins's face paled, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find a retort. But there was nothing he could say. His career, his reputation. All of it was now in jeopardy, and he had no one to blame but himself. Finally, he muttered, "Yes, sir," his voice barely audible. Without another word, Marcus turned his back on Collins and faced his father. The tension in the diner dissipated slightly as he approached Eli, his expression softening as he looked into his father's eyes. "Dad," he said quietly, his voice laced with regret. "I'm sorry. I should have been here sooner." Eli shook his head, placing a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You're here now, son. That's what matters." They stood there in silence for a moment, father and son, their bond as strong as ever. Eli felt a swell of pride, not only for the way Marcus had defended him, but for the kind of man he had become. In that moment, Eli knew that all the sacrifices he had made, all the hardships he had endured, had been worth it. The other patrons began to relax, the tension in the air dissolving as the officers turned to leave. Barnes gave Eli a small nod of apology, and Eli returned it with a quiet, forgiving gaze. Collins, however, left without a word, his head bowed in defeat. As the door closed behind them, a quiet murmur of relief and approval rippled through the diner. One of the patrons, a middle-aged woman with gray hair, approached Eli and Marcus, placing a gentle hand on Eli's shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything you've done for this town, and for this country." Eli nodded humbly, his eyes glistening with emotion. "Just doing my part," he murmured, his voice thick. As they sat down together, Eli and Marcus shared a quiet moment, a moment of understanding and peace. The storm had passed, but the lessons of the day would linger. For Eli, it was a reminder of the strength he had instilled in his son. For Marcus, it was a promise to always uphold the values his father had taught him: dignity, respect, and justice for all. With the officers gone, the diner was still buzzing with quiet murmurs. The patrons had seen a confrontation that was equal parts shocking and inspiring, a powerful moment of justice served in real time. But for Eli Sanders, the air was tinged with lingering pain and quiet reflection. Marcus reached across the table, gently taking his father's hand. "Are you all right, Dad?" he asked, his voice soft with concern. Eli nodded, the traces of a smile lifting the corners of his mouth. "I'm all right, son," he replied. "I've faced worse." But as he spoke, Marcus noticed the faint tremble in his father's hand, and the slight wince in his posture. Eli's calm had been unbroken through the ordeal, but the cost of that strength was apparent. Marcus felt a stab of guilt, wishing he had arrived sooner, sparing his father the pain of enduring that humiliation alone. "Why didn't you call me earlier?" Marcus asked, his tone pained. Eli sighed, his eyes settling on the coffee cup in front of him. "You have enough on your shoulders already, Marcus. I didn't want you to think you had to come running every time someone like Collins crosses my path. I didn't want to be a burden." Marcus shook his head, frustrated but understanding. "You're never a burden, Dad," he said gently. "I'm here because I want to be. Because I owe you more than I could ever repay." Eli met his son's gaze, his expression softening. "You don't owe me a thing, Marcus. You've made me proud every day of your life. That's more than enough for any father." The two men fell into a contemplative silence, each lost in his own thoughts. The patrons, who had been murmuring amongst themselves, gradually resumed their meals, though some stole occasional glances at Eli and Marcus, their expressions touched with respect. Sue, the diner's longtime waitress, approached their table with a sympathetic smile. "Mr. Sanders, Chief Sanders," she began softly. I'm sorry you had to go through that. I can't imagine what that officer was thinking." She shook her head, her gaze resting on Eli. "You didn't deserve any of that." Eli gave her a small nod of appreciation. "Thank you, Sue. Some people, they just see what they want to see," he said quietly, his voice laced with the wisdom of years. "Nothing I could say would change their minds." Sue hesitated, glancing around the diner. "Well, some people in this town feel differently," she added, gesturing subtly toward the other patrons. "You've got a lot of folks on your side, Mr. Sanders. We all respect what you've done, for this town and for our country." A few nearby diners nodded in agreement, offering Eli quiet words of support. Eli's face softened, touched by the unexpected show of solidarity. He nodded gratefully, acknowledging the sentiment. After Sue returned to her duties, Marcus turned to his father, his gaze intense with emotion. "Dad, you shouldn't have to deal with this. You've done more for this country, for this town, than most people could ever understand." Eli placed a steadying hand on Marcus's arm, offering a reassuring smile. "That's just the way of the world, son. I've learned to live with it. But you're changing things. You're making this town a better place for everyone. That's all I ever wanted." Marcus nodded, though his frustration lingered. His father's patience was a testament to the battles he had fought, the injustices he had borne in silence. But Marcus wasn't satisfied with silence. He was determined to bring about change, to build a town where people like his father could walk with the respect they deserved. As they sat there, the bell above the diner door rang again, and a few more patrons trickled in. Marcus noticed some of them glancing in his father's direction, a hint of admiration in their expressions. Word of the confrontation was spreading, and people were beginning to understand the strength of the man who had sat quietly through it all, refusing to bow to hate. Eli's gaze drifted out the window, his thoughts far away. After a few minutes, he spoke again, his voice soft, reflective. "You know, Marcus, there was a time when I believed things could change," he said. "Back when I first came home from the war. I thought my service might mean something, might make things different." He fell silent for a moment, the weight of years of memories settling over him. Marcus remained quiet, letting his father speak in his own time. "But coming home wasn't what I thought it would be," Eli continued. "I came back to a world that hadn't changed at all. People still saw me the same way, treated me the same way. Didn't matter what I'd done, what I'd sacrificed. I was still invisible." His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed a deep hurt, one that had settled within him long ago. Marcus reached out, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "I know, Dad," he said softly, "and I'm sorry you had to go through that. But things are changing now. They have to." Eli smiled faintly, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Maybe they are. Maybe that's why you're here, doing what you're doing." The two men shared a moment of quiet understanding, each taking comfort in the other's presence. The humiliation Eli had endured had left its mark, but he was more determined than ever to show his son that strength could endure even in the face of prejudice. After a few minutes, Marcus stood, helping his father up. "Come on, Dad," he said, his voice gentle. "Let's get you home. You've been through enough for one day." Eli nodded, allowing his son to steady him as he rose. He leaned on his son's arm as they made their way to the door, but his posture was proud, his gaze unbroken. As they passed through the diner, several patrons nodded to him, some reaching out to shake his hand or offer quiet words of encouragement. Outside, the air was crisp, the sky a pale shade of blue. The silence between them was comfortable, each step a reminder of the bond they shared, the unspoken respect that ran deeper than words. As they walked down the street, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. His father had endured a lifetime of prejudice and injustice, and yet here he was, as strong and resilient as ever. If Eli could bear all of that with grace and dignity, then Marcus knew he could keep fighting for a better town, a place where men like his father would never have to endure such indignities again. And for Eli, walking beside his son filled him with a quiet pride. Marcus was fighting for something he had always dreamed of, a world that was fair and just, a place where his own children and grandchildren wouldn't have to face the hardships he had known. As they reached Eli's front door, he turned to Marcus, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Son," he said, his voice steady, "promise me something." Marcus met his gaze, nodding. "Anything, Dad." Eli paused, searching for the right words. "Promise me you'll keep fighting for what's right. Don't let anger consume you. Stand your ground, but don't let them make you bitter. That's how we win." Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "I promise, Dad," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll keep fighting, and I'll make you proud." Eli smiled, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He reached out, pulling his son into a strong embrace. For a moment, they simply held each other, father and son, united by love, by history, and by a shared dream of a better world. As Marcus stepped back, Eli gave him a final nod, the kind of nod that spoke volumes. "Thank you, son, for everything." Marcus nodded in return, his face reflecting his father's pride. "No, Dad," he replied softly. "Thank you for teaching me what it means to stand tall." With a final wave, Marcus turned and walked away, his steps filled with purpose, a renewed fire burning in his heart. Eli watched him go, a small smile on his face, the feeling of hope rekindled within him. In that moment, Eli knew that he wasn't alone. He had a son who would carry on the fight, who would make the world a better place, not just for their family, but for everyone. And as he turned back to his quiet house, Eli felt a sense of peace settle over him. A peace that came from knowing that change was possible, that justice was worth fighting for, and that his legacy was in the very best of hands. The day after the diner incident, the sun rose on a town buzzing with rumors and whispers. News of what had happened to Eli Sanders spread quickly, recounted in hushed tones, passed along by patrons who had been at the diner and by those who had only heard secondhand. Some were outraged, others unsettled, and a few remained indifferent. But there was no denying that the confrontation had sparked something in the community, a kind of collective self-reflection, as people began to question the role of authority and the respect that all citizens deserved. Inside the police department, Marcus Sanders sat alone in his office, preparing for a difficult conversation. As chief of police, he had faced his share of challenges, but today felt different. Today, he would be addressing a matter that was as personal as it was professional. The way his father had been treated wasn't just a violation of ethics. It was an insult to the principles Marcus believed in, the ones he had sworn to uphold. A knock at the door broke through his thoughts, and he looked up to see Officer Joel Barnes standing there, his face tense and his posture stiff. Behind him, Lieutenant Ray Collins wore an expression of indifference, his arms crossed as though he were awaiting a routine meeting. "Come in," Marcus said, his voice steady but carrying a sharp edge. The two officers entered, Barnes with visible discomfort and Collins with a forced calmness that betrayed a hint of arrogance. Marcus gestured for them to take a seat, but Collins remained standing, his defiant gaze daring Marcus to reprimand him. Marcus ignored the silent challenge, focusing instead on the task at hand. He met their eyes, one by one, and let the silence linger for a moment, allowing the weight of his authority to settle over the room. Yesterday, you both made a decision, Marcus began, his tone cool and measured. You chose to harass an elderly man in a diner, a man who had done nothing wrong, who was simply waiting for his son. Do either of you care to explain why you thought that was appropriate? Barnes's face flushed, and he shifted in his seat, looking down at his hands. Collins, however, held Marcus's gaze, his expression unmoved. With all due respect, Chief Sanders, Collins began, his voice laced with sarcasm. We were just doing our job. The man, your father, was acting suspiciously, and we followed standard protocol. Standard protocol? Marcus repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. Standard protocol means patting down a 78-year-old man with a cane, tossing his veteran's cap on the floor, twisting his arm behind his back in a show of force? Collins shrugged, barely concealing a smirk. We had no way of knowing who he was. If he'd just cooperated from the start, we wouldn't have had to take those measures. Marcus's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he struggled to keep his anger in check. You had no way of knowing who he was? Lieutenant Collins, every person in this town deserves respect, whether they're related to the chief of police or not. He turned his gaze to Barnes, whose face had turned pale, his eyes fixed on the floor. Officer Barnes, do you have anything to say for yourself? Barnes swallowed, lifting his eyes briefly to meet Marcus's gaze before looking away again. I was following orders, sir. I didn't think it was right, but I didn't feel like I had a choice. His voice was barely a whisper, heavy with shame. You didn't think you had a choice? Marcus repeated, his tone a mixture of disappointment and sorrow. Officer Barnes, every choice you make in that uniform reflects who you are. And more than that, it reflects on this department, on every one of your fellow officers. You always have a choice. Integrity is a choice. Barnes nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging as he absorbed the words. He looked genuinely remorseful, but Marcus knew that remorse alone wouldn't be enough to repair the damage that had been done. Lieutenant Collins, Marcus continued, turning back to the defiant officer, you've been on this force for years. You know what this uniform stands for, what it means to serve this community. Yet you decided to use your position to humiliate and degrade an innocent man. Why? Collins's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of irritation. With all due respect, sir, this town has its problems. Not everyone who walks in here is a saint. I was doing what I thought was necessary to keep things under control. People like him don't always belong in certain places. Marcus's gaze turned cold. People like him? Collins hesitated, realizing he had said too much, but his pride kept him from backtracking. Look, Chief, you know how it is. Some people just don't fit. They make the rest of us uncomfortable. I was trying to avoid a bigger problem. Marcus took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as he tried to contain his anger. Lieutenant Collins, my father didn't make anyone uncomfortable. You did. You abused your authority, humiliated a man who had done nothing wrong, and made this town a worse place by spreading hatred and intolerance. Collins shifted, but his face was still set in a stubborn frown. So, what now? He asked, a slight sneer in his tone. Am I supposed to apologize and we all just move on? Marcus's eyes narrowed. Apologies aren't enough. You've shown me, and this entire town, that you don't have the respect or the integrity that this position requires. As of this moment, you're suspended without pay, and you'll be attending mandatory sensitivity and de-escalation training. If you ever step out of line like this again, you'll be looking at a permanent dismissal. Collins's face turned a deep shade of red, his jaw clenching as he absorbed the consequences. His pride had carried him far, but now it was clear that his arrogance had brought him to the edge of losing everything he'd worked for. And Officer Barnes, Marcus added, turning to the younger man, you're also suspended. I expect you to attend the same training sessions and to reflect on your role in this incident. I hope you'll come back a better officer, one who understands the responsibility that comes with this badge. Barnes nodded, looking thoroughly chastened. Thank you, sir. I'm sorry. Marcus gave him a nod, a small gesture of acknowledgement, but his expression remained serious. It's up to you now, Officer Barnes. Remember that integrity is always a choice. The two officers stood, Barnes looking shaken and contrite, while Collins's expression remained sour, his pride visibly bruised. They exited the office in silence, leaving Marcus alone with the weight of the day's events. Marcus leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and relief. He had done what was necessary, upholding justice not just for his father, but for everyone who believed in the values the badge represented. He knew his actions would likely stir resentment, and that not everyone on the force would agree with his decision. But he didn't care. This was about more than maintaining authority. It was about protecting the integrity of the community he had sworn to serve. Later that day, as Marcus was leaving the station, he saw a group of townspeople waiting for him outside. Some had been at the diner the previous day. Others had heard about what had happened. Among them were Sue, the waitress who had offered Eli kindness, and a few of the other regulars who had witnessed the confrontation. One of them, an older man with silver hair, stepped forward and extended his hand. "Chief Sanders," he said, his voice carrying a note of respect, "we wanted to thank you for what you did. A lot of us have seen things over the years that didn't sit right, but we never thought someone would actually do something about it." Marcus shook his hand, humbled by the gesture. "I appreciate that," he replied, his voice filled with sincerity. "I only did what was right. My father deserves the same respect as any other man, as does everyone in this town." Sue stepped forward, her eyes bright with gratitude. "Your father's a good man, Marcus. He's done a lot for this town, for this country. Seeing him treated that way, well, it wasn't right. But seeing you stand up for him, that gives us hope." Marcus felt a surge of pride, not only for his father but for the community he was a part of. He had taken on this role to make a difference, and now, for the first time, he felt that he was truly living up to that promise. After the crowd dispersed, Marcus returned to his car, his mind filled with thoughts of his father, the legacy he had left, and the road that lay ahead. He knew that there would be more challenges, more obstacles to overcome, but he was ready to face them with the same resilience and integrity that his father had shown him. As he started the car and drove home, he felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. The town was changing, slowly but surely, and he was proud to be part of that change. He had stood up for his father, for the values he believed in, and for the future he wanted to build. A future where everyone, regardless of background, could live with dignity and respect. And as he pulled into his driveway and saw his father's light on in the house, he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The diner incident continued to echo through the town like the low rumble of distant thunder, leaving a charge in the air that no one could ignore. People debated and whispered about what had happened. About Chief Sanders standing up to one of his own officers, about a veteran who had quietly endured humiliation, and about a community forced to look itself in the mirror. As for Marcus Sanders, the events of the past few days weighed heavily on him. The suspension of Lieutenant Collins and Officer Barnes had stirred up mixed reactions within the police department. Some officers felt Marcus had acted too harshly, while others applauded his decision. Marcus was used to hearing whispers behind his back, but this time, the stakes felt higher, the scrutiny more intense. And yet, he stood by his actions, knowing that upholding justice and accountability came with a cost he was willing to pay. Today, he had called a meeting with the entire department, a moment to address not only the incident but the deeper issues that lay beneath it. He knew it was time to set the tone for the future of his leadership and to make it clear what he expected from his officers. As he entered the briefing room, he saw his team already gathered, some seated with folded arms, others leaning against the walls. There was a tension in the air, an unspoken challenge radiating from certain corners of the room. Marcus didn't flinch. He knew he had to confront this head-on. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his voice steady as he addressed the room. "I called this meeting today because I believe we have some things to discuss, not just about what happened at the diner but about who we are as a department and what we stand for as officers of the law." A ripple went through the room, some officers shifting in their seats, others narrowing their eyes as they focused on him. "I know that some of you think I was too harsh in my handling of Lieutenant Collins and Officer Barnes," Marcus continued, meeting the eyes of those he could sense felt that way. "But let me be clear. My decision wasn't just about that one incident. It was about a pattern of behavior that I refused to tolerate. An older officer near the front, Sergeant Harris, cleared his throat, speaking up in a respectful but firm tone. Chief, with all due respect, Collins is well, he's rough around the edges, but he's always done his job. He knows this town, and he's been with us a long time. Marcus nodded, acknowledging Harris's words. Yes, he's been with us a long time, which is why he should understand the importance of respect, decency, and restraint. No one is above those principles, no matter how long they've been in uniform. The room grew quiet, Marcus's words settling over them with undeniable weight. Respect is not conditional, he continued, his voice resonating with conviction. It's not based on whether you think someone belongs in a place or whether they look like you. It's a fundamental part of what it means to serve and protect. And when any of us violate that, we undermine the trust that this community places in us. A few officers nodded, understanding dawning in their eyes, while others remained stoic, arms crossed, faces unreadable. Look, I'm not here to criticize anyone personally, Marcus said, softening his tone slightly. I know this job is hard. I know we see things that most people can't imagine. But that doesn't give us the right to treat people with anything less than the respect and dignity they deserve. He paused, letting the silence fill the room before speaking again. My father, Marcus said quietly, his voice taking on a more personal tone, served in the Vietnam War. He put his life on the line for this country. And yet, when he came home, he faced the same prejudice, the same hatred that he'd fought to protect others from. He spent his life working, raising a family, and being part of this community, only to be treated like a criminal by those who were supposed to protect him. The officers listened, some of them visibly affected by his words. The reality of the story, the reality of what had happened to Eli, began to sink in for those who hadn't fully grasped the depth of the incident. I want every one of you to ask yourselves why you wear this badge, Marcus continued. If it's for power, for control, or for anything other than a genuine desire to serve and protect, then you're in the wrong place. This badge isn't a license to intimidate or humiliate. It's a symbol of trust, a responsibility to do better than those who came before us. He scanned the room, his gaze resting briefly on each face. Some officers looked down, others met his gaze with understanding, and a few with lingering defiance. I'm instituting a new policy, Marcus announced. Every officer in this department will undergo mandatory training on de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and respect for veterans. This is non-negotiable. And going forward, we will be held to a higher standard of accountability. I will personally review all complaints filed against officers, and I will not hesitate to take action if I see behavior that undermines the values we stand for. A younger officer in the back raised his hand, hesitating slightly before speaking. Chief Sanders, I think what you're saying makes sense, he began. But, honestly, some of us are used to following the lead of people like Lieutenant Collins. This is going to be a big change. Marcus nodded, understanding the challenge he was presenting. Change isn't easy, I know, and it will take time. But if we want to build a department we can all be proud of, if we want the people of this town to truly feel safe, then we need to be willing to change. He paused, letting his words sink in. I can't force you to feel respect, but I can require you to act with it. And if you're not willing to do that, then you need to seriously reconsider why you're here. Another silence fell over the room, but this time, it was less tense, filled instead with the quiet weight of contemplation. The officers who had looked defiant before now seemed more introspective, their expressions softened. Look, Marcus said, his tone softening as he sensed a shift in the room. I know that for some of you, this might feel like a lot to ask, but I believe that each of you has the potential to live up to these standards. I wouldn't ask it of you if I didn't believe in you. Sergeant Harris nodded slowly, his respect for Marcus evident in his gaze. Thank you, Chief. We appreciate your honesty. And I think a lot of us understand where you're coming from now. Marcus felt a swell of gratitude as he looked around the room, sensing the tentative but hopeful support from his team. He knew that change would be gradual, that there would be setbacks and challenges, but he also knew that he had planted a seed that he hoped would grow into something better. As the meeting concluded, officers began to file out, some offering Marcus a nod or a quick word of appreciation. The younger officer who had spoken earlier approached him, his expression earnest. "Chief Sanders," he said, "I just wanted to say thank you. I think this is exactly what we need." Marcus smiled, a feeling of hope filling his chest. "Thank you. I appreciate that. We'll get there, one step at a time." After everyone had left, Marcus remained in the briefing room, the echoes of his words lingering in the quiet space. He knew he had taken a risk, that there would be resistance and perhaps even backlash. But he also knew that he was doing what was right, both for the town and for his father. Later that evening, Marcus returned to his father's house. Eli was seated on the porch, the sun setting in a blaze of colors behind him, casting a warm glow over his weathered face. Marcus joined him, taking a seat beside him in silence. They sat together, watching the sky fade from gold to purple, each lost in their thoughts. After a while, Eli turned to him, a quiet smile on his face. "You've had a busy day," Eli said, his voice filled with a gentle pride. Marcus nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You could say that. I think some of them understood. It's going to take time, but they're willing to try." Eli nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Change is never easy, son. But the hardest battles are often the ones worth fighting." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the day lifting as the stars began to emerge in the night sky. For Marcus, this was a moment of peace, a reminder of why he fought, why he stood up for what was right. He knew the road ahead would be long, but he was ready to walk it, side by side with the man who had taught him everything he knew about strength, resilience, and honor. As the night settled in, father and son remained on the porch, united by the quiet understanding that some battles would never truly end, but that every step forward was a victory worth cherishing. The following morning, Eli Sanders awoke to a different world, one where his dignity had been publicly restored by his son, yet one in which he still carried the quiet scars of yesterday's events. He rose early, as he always did, brewed a pot of coffee, and sat on his front porch, watching the sun inch its way above the trees. For Eli, this was his way of grounding himself, of finding peace in the midst of a storm. As he sipped his coffee, a car pulled up to the curb in front of his house. He squinted against the sun, recognizing the young, nervous face of Officer Joel Barnes. Eli watched in silence as Barnes stepped out of the car, his shoulders hunched and his gaze cast downwards. He hesitated at the edge of the walkway before finally mustering the courage to approach the porch. Eli regarded him with a calm, steady gaze, allowing the young officer to reach him without a word. "Mr. Sanders," Barnes began, his voice a little shaky. I wanted to come by to apologize. I know there's no excuse for what happened. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Eli remained quiet for a moment, studying the young man. He saw the remorse in Barnes's eyes, the earnest regret that was so different from Collins's arrogant bravado. Finally, he gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Sit down, officer," Eli said gently. Barnes hesitated, then lowered himself into the chair, his gaze shifting from Eli's face to his hands, which fidgeted in his lap. Eli took a slow sip of his coffee before speaking. "You know, son, I've lived a long time, and I've seen more than my share of anger, fear, and hatred. But I've also seen people change, grow, and learn to do better." He paused, letting his words sink in. "What you did was wrong. But sitting here, owning up to it, that's a step in the right direction." Barnes looked up, his face flushed with a mixture of relief and shame. "Thank you, sir. I was scared to come, honestly. I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me." Eli's gaze softened, a small smile touching his lips. "The fact that you're here says a lot. You've got a chance to make things right, not just with me but with yourself. You see, respect doesn't just come from a badge or a uniform. It comes from what you carry inside. If you want to do this job right, you need to understand that." Barnes nodded, his expression serious as he took in Eli's words. "I understand, sir, and I want to do better. I joined the force because I wanted to help people, but I lost sight of that. I followed the wrong example." Eli nodded thoughtfully. "We all make mistakes. The important part is learning from them. It sounds to me like you're willing to do that. They sat in silence for a few moments, the soft rustling of leaves the only sound between them. Barnes seemed to find comfort in the quiet, his body gradually relaxing as he absorbed the forgiveness Eli had extended. After a while, Barnes cleared his throat, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Sanders. I won't forget this. I promise you that." Eli nodded, extending a hand, which Barnes shook with newfound respect. "Take care of yourself, son, and take care of this town." Barnes rose, nodded one last time, and made his way back to his car, leaving Eli with a renewed sense of hope. He felt the impact of that brief exchange settle in his chest, a reminder that people could change, that respect and decency could be restored, one choice at a time. Later that afternoon, Marcus dropped by his father's house to check in on him. As he approached the porch, Eli greeted him with a nod and a knowing smile. "Had a visitor this morning," Eli said casually. Marcus raised an eyebrow, sensing that there was more to the story. "Oh, Officer Barnes," Eli replied, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "Came by to apologize. We had a good talk." Marcus nodded, his respect for Barnes rising. He knew the young officer had made mistakes, but he also knew how hard it could be to own up to them. "I'm glad he did, Dad. That took courage." Eli looked at his son, his gaze filled with a mixture of pride and wisdom. "He's got potential, that one. Just needed a nudge in the right direction. And it sounds like he's got a good leader to follow now." Marcus smiled, touched by his father's words. "I'm just doing what you taught me, Dad." Eli chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, son, you're doing more than that. You're changing things. The town's starting to see that there's more to this badge than power. They're seeing that it's about respect, for everyone." The two men sat together in companionable silence, their bond strengthened by the challenges they had faced together. Marcus knew that his father's wisdom was a gift, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. And Eli felt a renewed sense of peace, knowing that his son was leading a legacy he could be proud of. The following week, the police department launched the first of a series of training sessions, starting with de-escalation and cultural sensitivity. Every officer, including Marcus, attended, and though some approached it with reluctance, others, like Barnes, were eager to learn. Word spread through the town about the changes, and soon the community began to see the effects. The training sessions weren't easy. They brought up difficult conversations, challenged assumptions, and forced many officers to confront biases they hadn't realized they held. But the transformation was palpable. Officers began treating their interactions with the townspeople with greater care, and the citizens, in turn, started to rebuild trust in the department. Slowly, a bridge was being formed between the people and the police. For Marcus, these changes were a source of pride, a tangible reminder that even the smallest acts of courage could spark a ripple effect of respect and accountability. He received notes and calls from townspeople expressing gratitude, sharing stories of their renewed faith in the department. And while not every message was positive, Marcus knew that change was rarely easy and never unanimous. One evening, Marcus received a letter addressed to both him and his father. Inside was a handwritten note from a woman who had been at the diner that day, along with a photograph of Eli in his uniform, standing tall and proud. The letter thanked them both for their courage, for standing up to injustice, and for reminding the town of the importance of dignity. Marcus took the letter to his father's house, and the two of them read it together in the quiet of Eli's living room. Eli ran his fingers over the photograph, his eyes misty with a mixture of pride and emotion. "People are finally seeing you for who you are, Dad," Marcus said softly. "For everything you've done, for everything you've been through." Eli looked up, his expression one of quiet resolve. "It's not just me, Marcus. It's all of us. Every person who's ever had to fight for respect. Every family who's ever had to teach their children to stand tall in a world that tries to bend them low. What you're doing here, son, it's for them too." Marcus nodded, deeply moved. The impact of his father's words resonated within him, solidifying his commitment to the town and to the ideals they were building together. Days turned into weeks, and the changes in the community continued to grow. Eli noticed that when he visited the diner now, people greeted him with warmth and admiration. Sue, the waitress, would often stop by his table to chat, filling his coffee cup and sharing updates about the townspeople's gratitude for Marcus's leadership. Eli's quiet strength and dignity had become symbols of resilience for the community. One day, as he sat by the window sipping his coffee, he noticed a familiar figure walk into the diner. It was Lieutenant Collins, dressed in civilian clothes, his face devoid of the arrogant swagger he had once carried. He looked around the room, his gaze settling on Eli, and for a moment, he seemed to hesitate. Finally, he approached Eli's table, standing awkwardly as he fumbled for words. "Mr. Sanders," he began, his voice subdued. I wanted to say, I'm sorry. I was wrong." Eli regarded him with a calm, measured gaze, sensing the discomfort and shame that weighed on the man before him. After a moment, he nodded. "Apology accepted, Collins," Eli said quietly, his voice steady. "We all make mistakes. The question is, what will you do next?" Collins looked down, his face marked with regret. "I'm working on it, sir. I've got a lot to learn." Eli nodded, offering him a small, understanding smile. "Then take this as a new beginning. It's never too late to start doing right." Collins gave a stiff nod of gratitude before turning and leaving the diner, his shoulders a little less burdened. Eli watched him go, a sense of peace settling over him. The town was changing, slowly, yes, but surely. And as he sat there, watching the sunlight filter through the window, he felt a quiet pride in the world his son was helping to build. That evening, as Marcus and Eli sat together on the porch, they reflected on everything that had transpired. They knew there would be more challenges ahead, more moments of conflict, but they were ready. Together, they were creating a legacy of integrity and compassion, one that would carry on long after them. As the stars appeared in the sky, Marcus looked over at his father, his heart filled with gratitude and love. "Thank you, Dad," he said, his voice filled with quiet emotion, "for teaching me what it means to be strong." Eli smiled, reaching over to pat his son's shoulder. "No, son, thank you for proving that strength can change the world." And together, they sat in silence, watching the night settle over their town, knowing that they had planted the seeds of change, and that the future, while uncertain, was filled with hope. The morning air was crisp and cool, and for the first time in weeks, a sense of peace seemed to settle over the town. Word of the department's new policies and the public apologies from both Officer Barnes and Lieutenant Collins had spread, creating ripples of discussion throughout the community. For some, it was a step forward, a sign that accountability was finally making its way into the town's institutions. For others, it was a stark reminder of how far they still had to go. But for Eli Sanders, it was a quiet victory, one he never expected to see in his lifetime. As he strolled through the town square, he received nods and warm greetings from those he passed. Some even stopped to shake his hand, offering words of support and respect for both him and his son. He couldn't remember a time he'd felt so accepted in this place he'd called home for decades. As Eli neared the community center, he noticed a group of townspeople gathered outside, preparing for the evening's event. A town hall hosted by the police department, an open forum where citizens could discuss concerns, ask questions, and hear directly from Chief Sanders. It was Marcus's idea, a way to keep the momentum going and to make sure everyone felt heard. Eli was about to continue on his walk when he heard someone call his name. Turning, he saw Sue, the waitress from the diner, hurrying over with a warm smile. "Mr. Sanders," she called, adjusting her sweater against the breeze. "You're coming tonight, aren't you?" Eli smiled, charmed by her enthusiasm. "I hadn't planned on it, but I suppose I might drop by." "Oh, you have to," she insisted, her eyes bright with excitement. "You have no idea what kind of impact you and Marcus have had on this town. People are really listening. They're really thinking about things they never thought about before." Eli's smile softened, touched by her words. "I'm glad to hear that, Sue, but I didn't do much. It was Marcus. He's the one who's put in all the hard work." Sue shook her head. "Maybe so, but he's got your courage. I think people can feel that. You've made a difference just by being here, by being yourself." Eli chuckled, a glimmer of humility in his eyes. "Well, I suppose we'll see." That evening, Eli arrived at the community center, surprised by the turnout. People of all ages filled the room. Local business owners, families, and young people, all there to support Marcus and to learn about the changes taking place within their town. The air buzzed with anticipation, a palpable hope that this night might bring even more healing and understanding. Marcus stood at the front of the room, his calm, steady presence commanding attention. Eli couldn't help but feel a surge of pride as he watched his son, who, despite the long journey, had remained steadfast in his principles, carrying forward the values Eli had taught him. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus began, his voice resonating with warmth and sincerity. "Tonight isn't just about me or the police department. It's about all of us, about creating a community where everyone feels safe, valued, and respected." The crowd settled into attentive silence as Marcus explained the new initiatives within the department, including the mandatory training sessions, increased transparency, and the commitment to open dialogue with the public. His words were met with nods of approval, murmurs of support, and, at times, probing questions. But Marcus welcomed each question with patience, taking the time to address concerns and clarify misunderstandings. Eli noticed a familiar face near the back of the room. Officer Barnes, sitting quietly, listening intently, as though absorbing every word Marcus spoke. Eli felt a swell of pride for the young officer, who had been open to change and growth, even when it was uncomfortable. After Marcus finished outlining the changes, he opened the floor to the audience. One by one, people began to stand and share their thoughts, some voicing support, others hesitance, and a few expressing a cautious optimism. "I think it's about time we had this talk," said a middle-aged man near the front, his voice gruff but sincere. "We've seen things that didn't sit right, but we kept quiet. I know I did. But seeing someone finally stand up, seeing a young officer like Barnes willing to change, it gives me hope." The man's words were met with applause, and Marcus nodded in agreement, his face reflecting the gravity of the moment. Another person, a young mother holding her child, raised her hand. "Chief Sanders," she began, her voice soft but steady, "how do we know this change will last? We've seen good intentions fade before." Marcus paused, considering her question carefully. "That's a fair question," he replied. "The truth is, change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, commitment, and accountability. That's why we're here tonight, and why we'll keep having these town halls. Change has to be a continuous effort, something we work on together." The crowd murmured in agreement, reassured by Marcus's words. The young mother nodded, a look of relief on her face. As the meeting continued, people began to share personal stories, moments of prejudice they had witnessed, memories of times they had felt unsafe or unseen. It was painful but necessary, and as each story unfolded, a sense of unity grew, an understanding that these struggles weren't isolated but shared. Toward the end of the evening, Marcus invited Eli to come forward and speak. Eli hesitated, not used to the spotlight, but as he looked out at the familiar faces in the crowd, he felt a surge of gratitude. Slowly, he rose from his seat and joined his son at the front of the room. He looked out at the crowd, at the people who had shown him kindness, at the people who were finally ready to listen. Clearing his throat, he began to speak. "I've lived in this town a long time," he said, his voice low but steady. "Long enough to know that change is hard. Long enough to know that respect isn't always given freely. But I've also lived long enough to see people learn, to see hearts change." He paused, looking at his son with a mixture of pride and love. "My son here, he's given me hope, and I believe that if we keep working together, if we keep showing up for each other, we can make this town a better place. A place where we all feel like we belong." The room fell silent, Eli's words resonating deeply with each person present. And then, one by one, people rose to their feet, applauding Eli's quiet courage and Marcus's steadfast leadership. Eli felt his heart swell as he looked out at the crowd, feeling truly seen and valued. For the first time in his life, he felt like more than just a veteran, more than just a bystander in his own town. He felt like he belonged. As the meeting concluded, people lingered, talking with one another, sharing stories, laughter, and renewed camaraderie. Marcus and Eli stood together, accepting the handshakes and hugs from those who had attended. Officer Barnes approached them, looking relieved but thoughtful. "Mr. Sanders, Chief Sanders," he said, nodding respectfully. "Thank you both. Tonight was, well, it was something I'll remember." Eli patted his shoulder, giving him a warm smile. "Remember, son, change starts with one choice. You're doing just fine." Barnes nodded, visibly moved by Eli's words. "I'll keep trying, sir." "Thank you." As the crowd began to thin, Marcus and Eli shared a quiet moment, standing side by side, watching as people slowly made their way out of the community center. The town felt different, more hopeful, and Marcus knew it was a beginning, a fragile but promising start. "Feels like things are finally shifting," Marcus murmured, his gaze fixed on the people milling about, connecting, finding common ground. Eli nodded, his eyes reflecting a hard-won wisdom. "They are. But you know, son, the work's never really done. It'll take all of us to keep this going." Marcus looked at his father, a quiet pride filling his heart. "I know, Dad, and I'm ready for it." They walked together out of the community center and into the cool night. The town stretched out before them like a canvas, waiting to be painted with the colors of understanding, respect, and unity. The stars glimmered above, silent witnesses to a legacy of courage that spanned generations. Eli's hand rested on his son's shoulder, his heart at peace, knowing that Marcus would carry forward the lessons he'd taught him. And Marcus, feeling the strength of his father beside him, knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be, leading a town toward a future where everyone, no matter who they were, would be treated with the respect they deserved. The weeks that followed the town hall meeting brought a renewed sense of purpose to the town. The changes that Marcus had championed were beginning to take root, and a quieter, more hopeful energy seemed to permeate the community. Officers on the police force approached their work with a new perspective, carrying the lessons they had learned from Eli and Marcus into every interaction. As for Eli, he found himself experiencing a newfound acceptance within the town he had known for so long. Neighbors greeted him warmly on his morning walks, strangers nodded with respect as he passed by, and Sue at the diner always brought his coffee with a smile and a few minutes of friendly conversation. It was as if the town had finally opened its heart to him, embracing him not just as a face they recognized, but as someone they respected deeply. Eli took it all in stride, feeling a quiet pride as he saw his son's influence reshape the world around them. Yet, he knew that change was like a river. It required constant care to keep it flowing in the right direction. And so, Eli found new ways to contribute to the spirit of unity that Marcus had begun. One evening, Eli was sitting on his porch, the soft glow of dusk settling over the neighborhood, when he spotted a familiar figure walking up his driveway. It was Marcus, looking both relieved and content as he joined his father. "Got a minute, Dad?" Marcus asked, taking a seat on the porch steps. Eli nodded, giving his son a small smile. "Always." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last light of day slip behind the trees. After a moment, Marcus cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened, Dad," he began. "The diner, the department, the way the town has responded. It's all been bigger than I expected. But I think it's only the start." Eli nodded thoughtfully. "It's always just the start, son. Every step forward is a beginning, not an end." Marcus looked over at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and determination. "That's why I want to make sure this change lasts. I don't want it to fade away once people go back to their routines. I want it to be part of who we are, part of how we live." Eli smiled, reaching over to pat his son's shoulder. "And it will be, if we keep working for it. Change isn't a one-time thing. It's an everyday thing. Just keep leading by example. The rest will follow." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of his father's wisdom settle over him like a mantle. He understood now that his role as chief of police was more than just enforcing laws. It was about creating an environment where people felt seen, heard, and valued. And he knew that his father's legacy, his quiet resilience and dignity, was the foundation for everything he hoped to build. The following week, Marcus invited Eli to attend a special ceremony at the police station. The event, small but heartfelt, was organized to honor Eli's contributions to the community and his service to the country. Marcus wanted to make sure his father received the respect and acknowledgement he deserved. As Eli entered the station, he was surprised to see a room full of officers, town officials, and neighbors gathered in his honor. Officer Barnes stood near the front, alongside Sue from the diner and a few other familiar faces. A banner hung across the wall, reading, "Thank you, Eli Sanders, a lifetime of service and strength." Marcus took the podium, his face filled with pride as he addressed the crowd. "Today, we're here to honor a man who has shown us the true meaning of resilience and dignity," Marcus began, his voice steady. "My father, Eli Sanders, served this country with honor. He faced struggles that many of us can't imagine, but he never let bitterness or anger take hold. Instead, he taught us all the value of respect, kindness, and integrity. It's because of him that I stand here today, and it's because of him that we're building a community where everyone can feel safe and valued." Eli watched his son with moist eyes, humbled by the tribute. He had never sought recognition, never asked for accolades. But standing here, surrounded by his son and the townspeople who had come to respect him, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. Marcus stepped down and approached his father, holding a small box. "Dad, on behalf of the department in this town, I want to give you this." He opened the box, revealing a polished silver badge engraved with the words, "Honorary Officer, Eli Sanders." Eli took the badge, his hands trembling slightly as he ran his fingers over the engraving. He looked up at his son, his heart too full for words. A round of applause filled the room, and Eli shook hands with his friends and neighbors, each interaction filled with warmth and respect. He accepted the honor with humility, aware that this moment was as much about his son's journey as it was about his own. Eli knew that Marcus had created something truly lasting in the town, a spirit of unity and respect that would outlive them both. In the months that followed, Eli and Marcus continued to watch the town evolve. The police department's renewed commitment to transparency and integrity strengthened the trust between officers and the community. People felt safer voicing their concerns, and the officers responded with empathy and understanding. Officer Barnes, inspired by his time with Eli, took on a mentorship role for new recruits, helping them learn the importance of humility and compassion. The town itself seemed to flourish under Marcus's leadership. Businesses began to host community events, bringing people together and fostering connections that had once felt strained. Town hall meetings became regular, with residents showing up to discuss everything from local issues to new initiatives that would benefit everyone. Eli became a fixture at these meetings, quietly supporting his son and offering his insights when needed. People began seeking his counsel, seeing him as a pillar of wisdom and kindness. For the first time in his life, Eli felt truly at home in his community, not just as a resident, but as someone valued for who he was. One afternoon, as Eli and Marcus walked through the town square, they stopped to watch a group of children playing near the fountain. The laughter and shouts of joy filled the air, and Eli felt a pang of nostalgia, remembering a time when he had been young and full of dreams, hopeful for a world he hadn't yet seen. Marcus turned to his father, his face filled with quiet pride. "We did it, Dad," he said softly. "We're building the future we always dreamed of." Eli nodded, his gaze fixed on the children. "It's not just us, son. It's everyone who believed, who worked to make it happen. And it's those who will carry it forward." They continued their walk, the weight of their shared journey filling the silence between them. Eli knew that his time on this earth was finite, that the years left to him were few. But he also knew that his legacy was secure, that his son and the community they had helped shape would carry on the work of creating a world where dignity and respect reigned. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden light over the town, Eli felt a deep sense of peace. He had fought his battles, endured hardship, and ultimately witnessed the beginning of a transformation he had longed for his entire life. And now, walking beside his son, he felt a calmness that went beyond words. They paused at the edge of the square, and Eli turned to Marcus, his voice quiet but full of emotion. "Thank you, son, for everything." Marcus looked at his father, his eyes reflecting the love and respect he held for him. "No, Dad," he replied, his voice breaking slightly. Thank you. You've given me everything. They embraced, standing together as the last light of day faded into dusk, a symbol of the legacy they had built together. It was a legacy of strength, integrity, and hope, one that would endure long after they were gone. And as the town settled into the quiet of evening, father and son stood side by side, knowing that they had done their part to build a better world, one small act of courage at a time.